Hello, this is Mark from Enchantment of Eternity, and here is a video that is usually reserved for my Patreon supporters, those who support me on Patreon. But I decided to go ahead and release this as a preview for any of those who wish to watch it. Now, if you want to support, if you like my channel, you like what I do, and you want to support me on Patreon, and you want to see more content, it would be very much appreciated. For as little as $1 a month will gain you access to the series of videos I'm doing. I've done a lot of Patreon only videos before. I did a series about my favorite and least favorite director's cuts of movies. I did a video on my least favorite and favorite directors. And then I did my most overrated and most underrated films of all time. And at the moment, I'm doing a series about Star Trek, because most of my Patreon supporters do enjoy my Star Trek content. So I'm doing one about Star Trek novels in particular. So this video is about my favorite novels, and later I'm doing other topics about novels like my least favorite, or some particular novels of note, or maybe some novel series, just talking about the Star Trek novels in general. So if you want to support me on Patreon, you can click the link in the description below to go to my Patreon page. For as little as $1 a month, you get access to these videos. I also send out an email every month for the Patreon supporters that have a schedule of my release schedule for the coming month, so you know exactly what videos I plan on releasing and when. I do a pre-release of one video per month, where I will release it a couple weeks earlier than I do to the public for my Patreon supporters. I tend to do that Star Trek as well, since most of my Patreon supporters like the Star Trek content. And if you want to donate $10 or more a month, you will be able to request a video for me to do every time you donate $10. You can request any video you'd like me to do, as long as it's not too outrageous and it fits into the theme and content of my channel, and I will review it as do this video as soon as possible. So yes, if you want to support me on Patreon, link in the description below. In the meantime, very much enjoy this video. Thank you so much for watching. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Patreon-only video. This is for Patreon supporters. Thank you so much for supporting my channel. This is the first video in a series of videos where I will talk about the Star Trek novels. This topic was suggested by Patreon supporter Quack Addict. Thank you so much for suggesting this. And so this will be part 1 of 6 videos. One will come out each month, where I will talk about some of these Star Trek novels. Now, doing the research for there, I looked up how many Star Trek novels there are, and there are like hundreds, literally hundreds of them. And I then went to try to recount how many I read, so I had to look up all the titles and try to remember all the ones that I read. And I was surprised to learn that I've read over 100 of these novels. Now, most of these novels I've read when back in the 90s or the 2000s. I actually stopped reading Star Trek novels around the time the Enterprise was canceled, around 2005. So I haven't read any novels that came out after that, so I wouldn't be able to tell you what any of the recent novels were. And also the novels that I will talk about, it's been literally decades since I've read them, and I of course don't have time to read them again for this video, so I'm going to have to just go off of memory that it's a couple decades old, so maybe I'll forget some things or get some things wrong. But in this video, I'm going to talk about my favorite Star Trek novels, or my favorite standalone novels, rather than like series of novels. Later on, when a couple videos in the future, I'll talk about like how there's series of novels, so like there's specific topics like the Iconian Gateways, or there's like a series of novels that took place after Deep Space Nine finished, which I really love those novels. But I'm not here to talk about the series of novels I liked. I'm here to talk about standalone novels my favorite standalone novels that I always remembered. So yeah, let's just jump right into this. And the first novel I want to talk about is called Imbalance. Now, this is not a hardcover. This was just a standard paperback novel. I think they were released once a month. This is from Star Trek Next Generation. So this isn't... I don't think this is very well noted, but I personally like this novel a lot. So if this was about the Parada, I believe they're called. Now, if you recall, there are these insect aliens who were we heard them talk, but we never actually saw them, and they just appeared in that one episode of Star Trek Next Generation Season 1, The Big Goodbye, where there was that episode was about the holodeck, but there was a side plot of Picard having to make this speech to these insectoid aliens. He had to say it just right, otherwise they would have been assaulted. So he had to practice forever going, it was a bit silly. So this whole novel was actually visiting those aliens and seeing what they're like. So after the successful contact from The Big Goodbye, they contacted Starfleet and was like, oh, you need to, let's come visit us. We should make further relations. So they show up, and they're acting all weird, and they beam down several away teams, and they sort of get attacked by these aliens who are some of them are going crazy. There's mayhem everywhere. It's not organized attacks. It's just there's mayhem happening, and all the aliens are acting all weird. And they eventually found out that there's I don't know if you call it a disease, but it's a chemical imbalance that's affecting them and throwing them, because their insectoids are sort of all connected, so it's throwing off their entire society and making them act crazy. And the reason why certain members contacted Starfleet was so that they could help them. So eventually they figure this out, and they learn to help them and correct the imbalance, and they're forever grateful. But throughout the novel, if I recall, again, it's been several decades since I've read this, but I remember it stuck out there that there were several different character stories going on at the same time. There were different away teams in different parts of the planet dealing with different issues, if I recall. I can't remember exactly who was teamed up. I know LaForge and Crusher, I think, were in one storyline, and Riker and Data were in another storyline. I remember Worf was on his own because he was having to fight. All the insects were LaForge was dealing more with the engineering, and Crusher was dealing more with the medical issues, and Riker was dealing more with the diplomatic issue. So I remember, and I like that, because that's something you can't really do in the Next Generation TV show because of budgetary constraints. They can't really explore the planet and have these different characters and different parts of the planets and show all these complex societies and different situations. So I remember I really enjoyed this novel. Now, another novel I want to talk about that I always remember really loving is a novel called Requiem, and likewise, this was just another paperback monthly. It wasn't a hardcover special or anything, so it doesn't really stand out. But it was written by Michael Friedman, I think his name's pronounced. He wrote a couple of hardcover novels, so he was a Star Trek novelist of note. And he had a particular style. His style was... it's hard to say. It was more of drama related. He loved to do, and I'll talk more about him a bit later on as well, is that he loved to do novels about more character or romance based novels than action novels. And this novel was about Picard having to do negotiations with the Gorn. So that's why I bought the novel immediately, because it had the Gorn in Next Generation times, which is something we never, of course, see. I think they're name dropped a couple times in Next Generation, but we never actually see them. And so he's doing negotiations with the Gorn, but for some reason he gets blown back in time. I can't remember how, where he actually goes back in time to Cestus 3, which, if you're a Trek nerd, you know that's the planet from the original series episode, The Arena, where the Gorn are first introduced, or the only episode the Gorn appear in, really, other than that Enterprise appearance. But so he's blown back in time like a couple of weeks or months before the invasion. Now, if you recall the episode of Rena, Kirk and crew show up to Cestus 3, and they find that like the whole colony is wiped out by the Gorn, and there's only one survivor. So Picard goes back like a couple weeks before this tragedy takes place, so he realizes that everyone there is going to die, but he doesn't want to, temporal prime directive. He doesn't want to interfere with the timeline, doesn't want to mess things up, so he tries to keep a low profile and just find a way back to his time. But he ends up meeting a woman and falling in love. And it's a very effective romance story, I believe. And so it's kind of a city on the edge of forever feel to it, because he falls in love with this woman that he knows gonna die, and he can't do anything to stop it. And eventually, I think he does go back in time right before go back to the present, I should say, right before the tragedy hits. Or I can't remember if he was actually there for the attack or not. I think he might have been there for a little bit of it. But anyway, he goes back to the present, and he has to deal with the fact that, and it's funny because the one dude from the episode of Rena who survived, who's like, "Oh, I went crazy! They're attacked everywhere." Like Picard met him, and they showed him interacting with him. So anyway, Picard then goes back to the present, and then has to deal with the Gorn, realizing that they were responsible for killing this woman that he loved, but he understood like the diplomatic. It actually made him understand the Gorn better for some reason. He understood that they had a dark past that they need to move beyond, which is what made it more pressing that he do these negotiations right. So he went there and did the negotiations right because Picard's awesome. So as I said, it's been several decades since I read this novel, but I remember it was really good. So I was surprised that it wasn't really. It was kind of, it wasn't really a standout. It was just another paperback monthly thing. But I reckon it was one of the better novels I read. Anyway, another novel that I really enjoyed was Embody, and this was of a hardcover, so this was a big deal. A lot of people probably still talk about this. It's probably one of the best-selling Star Trek novels. So this is Star Trek Next Generation novel. It had to do with... It was really interesting because I think I listened to this one on audio, audiobook, because they didn't have all the Star Trek novels in audiobooks, but they had some of the, the more popular hardcover ones they had on audiobooks. So I try to listen to audiobooks whenever I can because I'm a really slow reader. So I listened to this one on audiobook, and this was it was written by Peter David, and I'll get to him later because at first I really liked him. But he has like a strange sort of, he was like, I think a well-known comic book author. Actually, he wrote a lot of comic books, and he started getting into Star Trek novels and writing them. And some of the characters do come off as not, like Riker in particular is more like your stereotypical hero, badass, swashbuckler type, which doesn't necessarily fit with the image of Riker in the actual show. But I think for the most part, this novel and the next one I'm going to talk about, it does actually really work. But later on, he went a bit too crazy, and I didn't really like him. But at first, I did quite like Peter David's Star Trek novels. Now, Embody was about... It started in this future where Riker was an admiral and Data was a captain, and Counselor Troy had died decades ago, and sort of Data is is studying the Guardian of Forever, and Admiral Riker gets in his head to use the Guardian of Forever to go back in time and change the timeline to save Deanna Troy's life. And so the first part of the novels were like really bleak, talking about how Deanna died and all of the her funeral and how that affected him and spiraled him into depression and all that. And so then the old Riker goes back in time and tries to get the young Riker to save Deanna's life. And I don't again, it's been decades since I read it, so I don't remember the specifics of what happened in this novel. But it did I believe they also had like flashbacks to when Riker and... So at the same time you get this story, you also get the story of when Riker and Troy first met, like back, which is implied in Next Generation, back in Betazoid when they were both really younger. I think some of these things might have been contradicted a bit by the episode Second what's it called? Second Chances, that came out in the 6th season, which is after this novel came out, because of course the TV show did not at all consider, like, they didn't keep continuity with the novels because they're not canon, which is fair enough. So it just means that some of the times in the novels try to establish backstory that gets contradicted later, but that's okay, because I still thought it was a really interesting story. It's an interesting story about Riker and Troy and why he left her and how they had to broke up. And so it was, the crux of the story was about the relationship, but the through story was about the Admiral Riker using the Guardian Forever to travel back in time to save her. So it's interesting. It was a good novel. I really liked it. They later came out with Embody 2, which had nothing to do with this. It was about Worf, but I'll talk about that in another video. I didn't really like that one. Anyway, let's get into another Peter David hardcover, and that's Q Squared. Now, for the longest time, I considered this my favorite Star Trek novel. I don't know if I'd still say that, but again, it's been decades. This is another one I listened to on audiobook. Now, this Q Squared was about, it had terrain from the original series episode Squire of Gothos, which is one of my favorite episodes of the original series, who, if you don't recall the episode, it was this, God, he had like godlike powers, and he took a crew to this like, I can't remember which century, maybe 16th century, I don't know, some old century setting, and he was acting like a squire, and he was being all prippy and making, using his powers to manipulate the crew. So it was very Q-like, and at the end of the episode, it was revealed that he was just a child, and his parents showed up and disciplined him and sent Kirk on his way. So this novel supposed that he is a Q because, he was very Q-like. And you could say that episode was probably a precursor to the Q. Like, Gene Roddenberry liked to do the godlike aliens. But this novel supposed that Terrain is a Q, and further that he's a child, and still a child, because Q time, of course, is very different than human time, and Q is having to look after him, and he ends up basically trying to destroy the entire space-time continuum. And they talk about the multiverse here, because this novel deals with 3 separate parallel universes at the same time. I think there's one parallel universe where Jack Crusher didn't die, and he's the captain, and Picard's the first officer of the Enterprise, which is very interesting. And I think that's the parallel universe we deal with the most. We get a lot of chapters in that universe. And then there's another parallel universe where it's basically the Yesterday's Enterprise universe. So I don't know how that works, because Yesterday's Enterprise was actually an alternate timeline, not a parallel universe. But it's supposing there's a parallel universe where the events of Yesterday's Enterprise happen, where their Federation's at war with the Klingons, and they're all whatever. And so Terlaine just does something to shatter the multiverse. All these parallel universes start blending in together and messing everything up. And I think he imprisons Q and fucks him up, where he's at the point of death. And so Q has to come back, and he's just a floating little thing. And I remember they do this thing where he goes back to the. They tried to say that it was Q in the events of the original series pilot. Where no man has gone before. If you remember the pilot, there's about these guys who get infected with these godlike powers, and they think they're like gods, so they try to kill Kirk. And this novel is supposing that was actually Q who did that by accident, because he was dying and trying to find someone to help, so he ended up inhabiting these humans and causing them to go mad with power, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, Q finally finds his way back, and he gets Riker and other people's help. And I think, if I remember correctly, Terrain was using Jack Crusher to manipulate Jack Crusher. And he was telling him that he was the only version of Jack Crusher who survived in the whole multiverse, which I find hard to believe, where all the other Jack Crushers died, and Beverly ended up with Picard, and so he drove him jealous and mad, so Jack Crusher ended up trying to kill Picard. I don't know. It's a bit crazy now that I say this aloud. And again, this is kind of Peter David. playing a bit fast and loose with the characters, not really being totally in character. But I do remember really enjoying that novel, especially the way it played with multiple parallel universes and having Trelane be accused, one of my favorite characters. So anyway, let's move over to another one of my favorite novels. Now this one, actually, let's move over to Star Trek Deep Space Nine novel, and this is another paperback they didn't make a big deal out of it. And this is another one that was written by Michael Friedman, who wrote Requiem. Now, he wrote a Next Generation hardcover novel. I believe it was called Reunion. It was probably before the episode Reunion came out. And that was about Picard's time during the Stargazer and him being reunited with his old crew from the Stargazer. And I remember I didn't really like that novel very much. I don't think I ever read it fully. I wasn't really interested in it. So Saratoga, of course, is the ship that Sisko served on during Wolf 359, we saw in the pilot, in that little intro in the pilot episode Emissary, where his wife Jennifer died. And so basically Saratoga was like the Deep Space Nine version of the other novel he already wrote, but instead of being about Picard reuniting with the Stargazer crew, it was about Sisko reuniting with the Saratoga crew. And I actually found this a lot more interesting. And then we met that Bolian dude who pulled Sisko away when Jennifer was dying, and they sort of course, they were reminiscent. It was like, hey, so good to see you, but then they also had this dark looming, the events of Wolf 39 looming over them, and of course members of the crew, like the Vulcan captain, had died, and so not everyone survived, and so they had this dark, and I think in both cases, in Reunion and Saratoga, it was about like a murder mystery, while in the present time, during the reunion, like someone is killed and you find out one of the members of the crew is responsible for the murder. So it was kind of an unoriginal novel. It was just almost a duplicate of the one he already did for Next Generation. But I like this one a lot better because it did flesh out Sisko's backstory, flesh out his character more. And like I said, Michael Friedman loved to do these character-based stories. So I really enjoyed that novel. Now, another novel. Now we'll move over to Voyager, where another novel I really liked from Star Trek Voyager was called The Escape. Now, this was the first novel of Voyager to come out is just a novelization of the pilot of Caretaker. So this was the first original novel. So they call it the second novel. Really, it's the first original Voyager novel to come out. So this is like while season 1 was airing, so all the characters are still new, which is always risky. And I actually found with Deep Space Nine Next Generation, those novels kind of sucked. But this one was actually really good. So The Escape is about, I think, B'Elanna, Harry Kim, and Neelix beam down to this planet looking for like research sources. And apparently this novel takes place like shortly after B'Elanna's promoted to chief engineer, so they deal a bit with that. So yeah, very early Voyager. And anyway, they beam down on what appears to be an abandoned planet with all these, abandoned ships and stuff for supplies, but Neelix pressed the wrong button and ended up traveling like 500,000 years into the past and to this society that's fully grown and is a full-on civilization. You find out that this civilization actually lives in it's hard to explain, but they live in different time periods and they travel between the time periods, but there's only specific increments of time periods, if you know what I'm saying. Like there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of years that are considered blackout time periods where no one is allowed to live. Those are like red zones. So you have to, it's like because the time goes like concurrently with each other, so they travel. It's, hard to explain, but it's really, the book novel does a much better job of explaining it, and it made total sense there. And because Neelix and B'Elanna traveled from a dark period, and so they didn't travel in the correct increments, they were considered criminals and locked up, and then the aliens send someone to the present times of Voyager to try to scare Voyager away, but it doesn't work. And so the time, apparently it's very interesting because I remember the time travelers or these aliens realized that B'Elanna and the others, when they told them that their appeals have been denied, so they're going to be in prison forever, that they escaped. So the aliens sent someone back in time to kill them before they can escape, which is, very interesting. So they actually die, but then in the present time, Janeway captures the alien, convinces him to go back in time. And instead of killing B'Elanna and the others, they poison them to make it look like they've been killed, but really they take them back to the present and everything's okay. So it was a really interesting novel. I liked it. It was a weird sci-fi concept that I think was actually executed very well. Anyway, let me get to the final novel I want to talk about here in this video, and that is, again, a Voyager novel. This one is called Echoes. Again, this deals with a really interesting sci-fi premise, which is what Voyager, I think, can be really good at. And I think the novels, this one and the last one, do a good job of exploring this even more. Now, this novel, I believe, takes place during the second season. I think it was written, I think it came out in the third season, maybe even fourth season, but it was written kind of during the second season. It takes place shortly after the episode Deadlock, which is one of my favorite episodes, and I think they might even reference that episode in this novel. But anyway, in this novel, they travel to... Voyager goes to this empty space, and there's a bunch of dead bodies just floating in space. And I'm like, oh, what the hell is going on? Oh no, or do they go to the planet? I don't know. It's hard to, maybe they go to a planet and they find that it keeps shifting. And so basically what it is, and we deal with multiple parallel universes, so we see multiple different versions of Voyager, and what it is that this planet is shifting every couple days or whatever, where everyone on the planet shifts into another parallel universe. And it's like a cycle, so it's hard to explain again, but every parallel universe, they think of it as a circle of all these parallel universes, and so every time a shift happens, each universe shifts into the next one, so it's like a whole circle. So the one behind you goes into that one, and that one goes into the next one, and the next one goes into that one. And so there's one parallel universe where the planet doesn't exist, and so Voyager's just there in empty space, and there's a bunch of dead bodies. And eventually they start to see, because versions of Chakotay and the Away Team start to appear in this flotation of bodies, because the ones who were in the previous one keep shifting. But we also follow other Voyagers where Chakotay and his Away Team was on the planet, but all of a sudden they're gone and replaced by a different Chakotay and Away Team. Sometimes the Away Team's not even Chakotay. Sometimes it's different versions, different characters who are not even on Voyager. And the Chakotay, I think our main Voyager, the Prime Universe, shall we say, Voyager is the ones we follow, and they try to get Chakotay and Harry Kim and all them back, but the actual Chakotay keeps shifting into a different parallel universe. So it's very interesting. I think eventually they find a way to undo it and erase the timeline so this never happens. If I remember correctly, as I said, it's been a while since I read it. But I remember that being very fascinating. So that's a novel that I really liked. Anyway, that is it. That is all the novels. Those are my favorite standalone Star Trek novels. So that's all I have for you this month. Next month I'll be back with my least favorite standalone Star Trek novels. The ones that I didn't really care for. And I think are particularly bad. So this is going to be more negative. In the future, I also have topics of special novels of note. That is, novels that are not necessarily either good or bad. They're not my favorite or worst. But I think they're worth talking about. I have things I want to say about. And then I also do another video about the post-Deep Space Nine, post-Voyager novels. That is a series of novels that came out after those shows have finished to continue the story, which I actually really liked and thought was really interesting, so I can't wait to get into that. And then I also have a different video where I'll get into multi-show miniseries, where we'll have several miniseries that will like make up like 4 or 5 books, but each one will take place in a different series, if you know what I'm saying. Like the first one will be original series, then it'll be Next Generation, then Deep Space Nine, then Voyager, and they keep expanding this. So get into those in another video, and then I'll also talk about original novels that create their own series. So rather than being set in like Next Generation or Deep Space Nine, they make up an entire new ship with new characters, or a space station, or Klingons, or something like that. Those were very interesting, so I'll get in those in that last video about originals. But for next month, I will get into my least favorite standalone novels. So thank you guys so much for supporting my channel. It's very much appreciated, and I hope you enjoy these videos about Star Trek novels. Take care.